10 days after the rout of Prince Charlie's army at Culloden, he was here on Benbecula. After what a terrible crossing of 90 miles of stormy sea, so getting here was a bit of an accident. The crew were 7 Clanranald boatmen who were willing to do anything the Prince wanted, and the companions of the Prince were O'Sullivan, O'Neill, Father Alan MacDonald, Donald MacLeod and Ned Burke. They were hardly away before they were all wishing they could turn back as the boat was swamped by breaking waves and filling with water. They could only just let themselves be carried on because the sea was getting rougher and rougher. And when daylight broke, the pilot recognised a piece of coast and landed them amongst the rocks you see here at Rossinage. The landing was not unobserved. A herdsman had seen them land, and he carried the news to the chief of Clanranald. Soon the fugitives had a visit from him, and the Prince's party told him that they were leaving that night under assumed names, pretending to be Orkney folk wrecked off Tiree, trying to get home. Well, this is really the beginning of an amazing tale, which no novelist could surpass. No manhunt in history compares with what was to lie ahead for bonny Prince Charlie, beginning with 2 months of high drama in the Hebrides, leaving this rocky coast, the east coast of Rossinage and Benbecula, to sail north for Scalpay. As you come up, the way Charlie came from Benbecula, along a very bleak coast, you turn the corner of this peninsula and suddenly in front of you is a village, the village of Scalpay. Well, there was nothing here except one house when Charlie came here. And he needed a friend, and he found one in the only house of Donald Campbell. Donald Campbell was trying to make a living off the land here, which is a very, very bare kind of living indeed. Well, this is a real link with living history. This 3-legged pot Charlie and his men used in Scalpay to cook a meal. Maybe it was fish. Wouldn't it be potatoes, because if the potato wasn't eaten in the Hebrides then. But I can imagine a good brew coming out of this, and they would be hungry for it. So it survived a long time, since 1746. Sky frail now, though. Exciting things were happening while Charlie was in Scalpay. On the mainland near Malig, 2 French ships that had come to take him back to France were fighting a punishing gun battle with 3 British ships of the Royal Navy. Also in Stornoway, where the Prince was going, the Seaforth Mackenzie were in a state of alarm and had armed themselves against him on a false rumour spread by the Reverend Ollie Macaulay that Charlie had an army with him and would seize a boat. But when the Prince set off, he knew nothing at all of what was happening. And he started off first by a borrowed boat to the head of Loch Seaforth. Now this particular loch trenches the wildest hills of Harris, notoriously squally too, and with no roads along its 12-mile length even today. The hills drop in height as you go up, and the district is appropriately known as lochs, for there is as much water as land. Loch Seaforth gives out in peat blanket, and the knolls entrap freshwater lochs of every shape and size. Once they abandoned their boat, the guide got lost because it was getting dark, and they walked into a nightmare as wind and rain bewildered them as they stumbled about, and they were desperately tired. No wonder Sullivan described this as the wildest country in the universe. Not a house, not a track, nothing in sight, always heavy rain. And they'd been on the go for 18 hours. By Jove, they must have been weary. But they'd sent the guide ahead to find old Donald, and he came with brandy and bread and took them to a good house, the house of Lady Culldun. Charlie is said to have raged with anger and fear, but was too tired to move whatever the mob did. On the advice of Lady Culldun, they set off in their 6-oared boat down the coast of Lewis for Benbecula, where they would get the protection from Clanranald. Well, 12 miles down the coast, 2 fighting ships hove dead ahead, and the boatmen were sure they were British men of war. But O'Sullivan and the Prince declared them to be French and wanted to make an approach, pretending they were fishermen. But the boatmen wouldn't hear of it, not even for an offer of money. John Gibson, author of Ships of the 45, believes that the ships were French, the beginning of a massive operation to rescue the Prince.
That is precisely what they were, because we have the full record of the trip of these 2 French ships, which set out a fortnight before Culloden to bring him back, if indeed he was in dire straits. These are the 2 French ships which were set about in Loch Nanua in Moidat by 3 small, well, 1 frigate, 2 sloops of the Royal Navy set about them, and although they were very much bigger, they very gallantly held to their task and damaged them so much that they had to make off for France with something like 100 dead and wounded aboard. The rescue attempt really was intended to bring him off, and had the French ships not been so beaten up in Loch Nanua, they would have gone over and spent a week or so in the Outer Hebrides, and as long as was necessary, until they found Charles Edward. Standing here so near where she lived for so many years, I feel great qualms about suggesting that perhaps Flora MacDonald, by spiriting the Prince away to Skye, prevented his rescue by attempt number 3, and prolonged his ordeal by another 3 or 4 months. One can't really suggest that, because all the evidence is that the hunt was close round about him on Benbecula, and Flora did rescue him from mortal peril. But nonetheless, the rescue attempt, this by another little ship, a cutter, say something like the size of a Bucky seine netter, it came into Benbecula just 4 days after Flora had taken him across the sea to Skye. And that was the rescue attempt, of course, which made, above all others, made possible the final success. They didn't find Charles Edward, but they found O'Sullivan, who had to be left behind. He was lame, exhausted, and of course Flora insisted that she would only take across Charles Edward. She couldn't be encumbered with any of his followers. O'Sullivan went aboard this little ship called the Sturdy Beggar, and with her went back to Bergen, and then from Bergen he got word to Paris that further rescue attempts must make contact in South Uist with the gentlemen of Clanranald there, and they would point the way to where the Prince was if he had still escaped capture.
French or British? Because of the boatmen's fear, they couldn't wait to find out, but quickly rounded a headland and pulled into a small island. There was a strong wind blowing, the sea was running, it was raining heavily, but here they to live as best they could for 4 days. And the Prince proved himself a bit of a chef when he was here, turning oatmeal and the brains of a cow into a unique sort of bannock. Well, this is Glen Corradale, a place I've always wanted to visit, one of the remotest places in Britain where the sea comes in a wee bay under the high peaks of Benmore and Hecla. There's no easy way to it, and when Charlie came here, he walked over the hill. And here he spent, undoubtedly, I think, the 3 happiest weeks of his adult life. Now remember, we left him on an island, way up there where they spent 4 days where he baked that fancy bannock. Now coming down the coast, he was pursued by enemy ships. They gave him the slip. They made contact with Clanranald again, and Clanranald got them across the hill here. And what made the 3 weeks happy for Charlie was he had a constant stream of visitors. Clanranald gave him a fine tartan suit. He had any amount of whiskey and brandy. The company, he felt safe because the big search had not yet taken place. Then came bad news. Suddenly they were in danger because a force of militia had landed at the north end of South Uist and at the south end, and they were going to comb the island until they met in the middle. and searched everywhere because it was known that Charlie was in South Uist. So they cleared out, moved up the coast a bit to a wee island called Weir. The troops were everywhere. They were even arresting people. So it was necessary for them to move down the coast, and they moved down to Loch Boisdale. Here at Loch Boisdale, the Prince found even more enemy ships and troops, and for several days skulked in fields and creeks, sleeping rough. Then one of his companions, Neil McKeechan, guided them in moonlight to the country of a woman he knew where to find, Flora MacDonald. Did she hatch the famous plot to smuggle the Prince to Skye, dressed as her maid Betty Burke? And what was Neil McKeechan's role? He certainly was an extraordinary man whose role in the 45 has been underplayed.
He was certainly a serving soldier in the French army at the time, and because of his training for the priesthood in France, he obviously was a considerable linguist, and he was able to correlate various planning exercises in the attempt to extricate the prince from his encirclement in South Uist.
At Flora MacDonald's birthplace in South Uist, Alistair MacLean, brother of the Gaelic poet Sorley MacLean and the island's doctor for 30 years, claims that McKeechan's role was underplayed by Flora because he was still working as a Jacobite agent long after Culloden. Dr. MacLean also believes that the person who hatched the plot to get the prince to Skye could well have been Lady MacDonald, a secret Jacobite whose husband actually commanded the enemy militia.
Most of the evidence points in her direction. She certainly was capable of it, and there are many instances in when one can see that she was directly involved and that she was planning the arrangement.
This is where Charlie landed with Flora MacDonald, dressed as Betty Burke. And the last moments in Benbecula had been really dangerous. General Campbell was closing in. A great force of troops had already occupied Clanranald's house. But even so, the boat party still had to wait for evening before it was safe to take off. And that party were the Prince, Flora, Neil McKeechan, who was to see the bold plan through, and 4 boatmen, 2 of them MacDonald's and leave from the army that was searching for the Prince. At Vatternish Point, only a broad loch separated them from where they wanted to go. But as they went forward, they were shouted at by enemy troops. They ignored the cry of "pull in" and got here at 2 p.m. on Sunday the 29th of June. This too was a hot spot for bonnie Prince Charlie. For on the house on the hill just up there, the house of Monkstadt, the home of Sir Alexander MacDonald, who was hunting the prince, it was a very serious situation. The serious situation was this. Sir Alexander, commander of the militia, was in Fort Augustus, and in the house was a Lieutenant MacLeod with some of his troops. Lady MacDonald, who had plotted the escape unknown to her husband, was in a quandary when Flora MacDonald and Neil McKeechan came to the door. This was the dangerous bit, as Flora was introduced to an officer who was curious to know where she had come from and where she was going. She had to keep him interested with chit-chat. I believe she was very good at it. While Lady MacDonald did some good organisation work, getting her factor, MacDonald of Kingsborough, to go to the Prince on the beach. And then her ladyship sent off Donald Roy by horse to Portree to organise a boat to take the Prince from there to the island of Razzie. Well, brains were working hard. The Prince would have to have a bed for the night before walking to Portree. Where? At Kingsborough with the factor's family 5 miles south. The Prince, travelling as Flora MacDonald's maid, alarming them all by hoisting his skirts in unseemly manner to cross a swollen burn. An odd muckle callop of a carlin making lang wide steps was one description. It was after 10 o'clock at night when the Prince arrived here at Kingsborough. Within this present house is contained the old one, or so the owner tells me. And it makes me think of the surprise of Kingsborough's wife when she found she was to entertain a prince, and a hungry one at that, ready for a supper of roasted eggs, collops and plenty of bread and butter. Then as he sat back, calling for the brandy bottle, saying he had learned when skulking to enjoy a hearty dram. Now, the bed must have felt good too that night, with smooth sheets on it, the prince's first since Culloden, and he didn't get up until the day was well on. In fact, he was still in bed when Flora was pushed into the room by Kingsborough's wife with scissors in her hand to ask for a lock of his fair hair. So it was late in the day when Charlie left Kingsborough with a small boy to guide him the 14 miles to Portree. An uncomfortable walk too in the drenching rain. So no wonder when he got to McNabb's Inn in Portree, he called for a dram and stood drinking it at the bar. The old inn was in the same site as the present Royal Hotel above the harbour. Donald Roy, who had set off immediately the Prince landed in Skye, had carried out his commission by having a boat crewed ready to wait for Rassie. The Prince was in no hurry to take it. He wanted tobacco, and he called for a roll, 4p halfpenny, a quarter of a pound. Then he emptied a bottle of brandy, split between Donald Roy, Neil McKeechan and himself. Flora sat quietly watching, and the Prince's last words to her were, "I believe, madam, I owe you a crown of borrowed money," to which she replied, "Only half a crown." He then left the inn to go down to the waiting boat at dawn to head out to Rassie, and it was a lot less safe than he supposed. The small island had been pillaged by the hated Captain Ferguson, leading a force of sailors, marines and militiamen to teach the Rassie Jacobites a lesson. About these times I talked to Sorley MacLean, who was born on the island of Rassie.
John Finlayson from Drumboy, who died 8 or 9 years ago, was a very, very great tradition bearer. He got a great deal of his traditions from his mother, but more evidently from an old man who was a weaver in Drumboy in Lochalsh. This man was called Roderick Matheson, and he died about 1906, and he was about 100 years old. Now, Roderick Matheson remembered an old woman who had seen the houses along the southeast and east of Rassie ablaze after Culloden.
That's a remarkable story. It shows you how recent the history really is.
Yes, it does show how very recent it is. Strangely enough, however, there are very few traditions of the 45 left in Rassie in spite of what it suffered. I think that may be due to two things, partly to the great evangelical revival of the early 19th century, which condemned such traditions as vanity, and also to the fact that there were so very many of the population of Rassie cleared by Rainey in the 19th century. Rainey made the big clearances of something like 94 or 97 families.
Hence the great number of ruins that are scattered all over.
Yes, there are a great number of ruins.
So your memories of these times has resulted in some of the poetry that looks back to the people who've gone.
Yes, one, for instance, is very conscious in places like Scrapeadle, where there's not a soul nowadays, and Hallig, of the days gone.
I will go down to Hallig, to the Sabbath of the dead, where the people are frequenting every single generation gone. They are still in Hallig, MacLeans and MacLeods, all who were there in the time of Mach Gilliachalum. The dead have been seen alive.
The Prince was always lucky in finding the right man when he needed him most. Now it was Captain Malcolm MacLeod of Rassie who saw him back to Portree, and after a night in a cow byre and skulking all day, they set out for Elgall, a good 24 to 30 miles over the hills, and by the detours they would have to take, it was going to be a very hard journey. Walking from Portree, they came by Glenvarrigal, but not down to Sligachen. They took keep behind a ridge because there was a dangerous army garrison there. So they came down behind the ridge, then swung away west to come under the high peak of Scourn and Gillian into Glen Sligachen, and then over a pass in the mountains to reach the sea. One stop that they had to make, though, was to delouse the prince. The captain saw that he was lousy. He must have picked up these parasites in the cow byres, and I believe 80 lice were taken from Charlie. And then they came down to Elgall and to the house of Captain Malcolm's sister, and she made them welcome and kept watch outside while they had a well-earned sleep. And when the prince was awake, he had made up his mind that somehow or other he must get to the mainland. Now they had to find a boat. Captain John McKinnon went off to engage one, not intending to tell the old chief, but meeting him on the road, the tale was told, and the chief of the McKinnon took command. At 8 or 9 that night, they went down to the shore, Captain Malcolm seeing them off before heading back across the hills to Rasay. Aboard the boat with the prince was the old McKinnon, Captain John, and 4 men at the oars. They were off, round the point of Slate to land on the edge of some of the wildest country in the Western Highlands, where even more difficult trials lay in wait for the prince. The prince was away, but what happened to all those Hebrideans who took great risks for him? Well, most of them finished up in jail, in the hulks in Tilbury. They had a rotten time. But what about Flora? Well, Flora was treated as an honoured guest. She was lodged in a mansion house. Even the Prince of Wales came to see her. By public subscription, hundreds of pounds were raised. And when she did travel back to Skye a free woman, she had to change her name to Miss Robertson to avoid inconvenience, so many people wanted to talk to her. She married Alan MacDonald of Kingsborough, and in time she entertained the great Dr. Johnson, who was allowed to sleep in the room occupied by the prince. The room had been kept as he had left it, even to the prince's half-burnt candle, which Johnson lit. But farming in Skye wasn't prospering. There was a lot of emigration, and Flora's family left Kingsborough for North Carolina. And there they got caught up in the American War of Independence. And her husband, Alan, and 2 of her sons joined the Royal Emigrant Regiment. Alan was a brigade major, then he was taken prisoner. And Flora too was taken prisoner, and they lost everything they possessed. Flora was able to return to the Hebrides, and when 5 years later Alan joined her, they took this small house at Pendoon in Skye. Flora died in the wee house above the shore at Pendoon, and her body was carried across the swollen Hinnesdale River to lie in state for a week in Kingsborough, where Prince Charlie had spent the night. Flora's shroud was one of the sheets from Charlie's bed. She was 68 and outlived the prince by 2 years. Flora's was the biggest funeral ever seen in Skye. 300 gallons of whiskey were consumed at it. But this is not the original monument. Souvenir hunters came and destroyed the monument to carry wee bits away. The words of Dr. Johnson express what the whole world thought of her. Her name will be mentioned in history, and if courage and fidelity be virtues, mentioned with honour. Flora bequeathed to her children her 2 most precious possessions, the lock of hair snipped from the prince's head when he stayed the night in Kingsborough, and the silver shoe buckle he gave her when he changed his sex from being a man to a maid, Betty Burke, Flora's maid.